Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're going to dive into the truly fascinating and honestly highly contested mind map of what the word democracy actually means. We throw that word around all the time, right? We just assume everyone's operating under the exact same definition. But as we're going to see, by tracing its evolution through 5 really distinct theoretical models from our source material, you'll realize just how radically different those definitions can actually be.
You hear the word every single day. But if you were to ask a minimalist, a liberal constitutionalist, or a deliberative theorist to define it, you'd get completely different answers to this fundamental question. Like, is it just a mechanical process of counting votes? Is it a thick set of protected rights? Or is it maybe an entire culture of conversation?
So, we've built a structured map for our journey today. We're going to start at the minimalist baseline, build up to the liberal constitutional bulwark, move through the deliberative and participatory models, and then finally end up at the modern political constitutional pushback.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the minimalist baseline. This is basically the incredibly thin foundation that almost all the other theories are reacting against.
The crucial takeaway here is that, in this view, democracy is nothing more than a mechanism. It's literally just a set of rules for aggregating preformed preferences and holding competitive elections where parties can actually lose. That's it. In this model, you don't need highly engaged citizens bursting with civic virtue, and you definitely don't need some thick layer of constitutional rights. You just need a competitive method to pick leaders.
Joseph Schumpeter really hit the nail on the head for this camp. This stark quote from him completely rejects any romantic ideas about a unified common good. To Schumpeter, democracy is nothing more than a competitive struggle for the people's vote. Period. It's just a marketplace for power.
And looking at the key theorists here, we see a few slight variations on this mechanical view. Adam Przeworski defines it with ultimate simplicity, saying democracy is just a system where parties lose elections. Meanwhile, you have scholars like Anthony Downs and William Riker who pioneered this economic theory of democracy. They essentially view voters as rational consumers. The whole thing is purely aggregative, like tallying up arbitrary choices at a checkout counter.
But is that thin model actually enough? Well, that brings us to Section 2, the liberal constitutional bulwark, which is all about constraining those majorities.
So, this liberal model demands what we call thickness. It argues that majorities absolutely have to be restrained. Because think about it, you can't just have 51% of people voting to strip away the basic rights of the other 49%, right? This model insists on robust, ironclad protections for things like speech, association, and property, all enforced by the rule of law and the separation of powers.
Scholars Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Hook break this down really cleanly. They argue that a true democracy requires 3 intertwined pillars acting together: competitive elections, liberal rights, and the rule of law. It's like a 3-legged stool. If you take away the liberal rights or the rule of law, the elections all by themselves just aren't enough to hold the whole thing up. We're moving way beyond just counting votes here.
And this is incredibly relevant today. As explored in works like Constitutional Democracy in Crisis, scholars such as Kim Lane Shipole argue that this thick, rights-based model is the ultimate defense against autocratic legalism. That's when autocrats use thin legal maneuvers to subvert a democracy from the inside out. In this view, courts and constitutional rights are the absolutely necessary guards at the gate.
Now, if the liberal model adds rules, our next model adds conversation. Welcome to Section 3, deliberative democracy, the reason-giving model.
The massive shift here is that reason-giving suddenly matters way more than vote counting. For deliberative theorists, you can't just secretly cast a ballot based purely on your own selfish interest. Your decisions actually have to be publicly justified to your fellow citizens through respectful exchange. True democratic legitimacy stems from the actual quality of the dialogue. Jürgen Habermas frames this concept so beautifully. He imagines this ideal speech situation based on communicative action. In this ideal space, truth and consensus emerge not from who has the thickest wallet or the most political leverage, but from what he calls the unforced force of the better argument. It's a really optimistic, highly rational view of how we can interact. And it's fascinating to see how this theory has evolved. It started off with the first generation, Habermas, John Rawls, Joshua Cohen, who were really seeking pure consensus through public reason. But then the second generation, folks like Jane Mansbridge and John Dryzek, realized, hey, pure consensus is incredibly hard in the real world. So they shifted focus to managing systemic disagreement and pluralism.
And finally, you get epistemic Democrats like Helene Landemore and David Aslund, who make this amazing argument that deliberation is actually truth-tracking. They argue that cognitive diversity, just having different types of minds in the room, produces objectively smarter, better collective decisions than random chance ever could.
But, okay, what good is all this high-minded deliberation if the masses aren't actually involved? That brings us to Section 4, the participatory engagement model. Here, the absolute center of gravity is everyday, mass citizen involvement. And we're not just talking about what happens in the Capitol building once every 4 years. We're talking about all spheres of life, even the workplace. Scholars like John Dewey argue that democracy isn't merely a form of government, it's a living culture of social inquiry. It's a habit you practice every single day that actively empowers you and breaks down inequality.
We can see this so clearly when we contrast it with where we started. Remember Schumpeter? He said voters are basically passive consumers and that elites should just run the show. Well, participatory theorist Carol Pateman says a resounding no to that. She argues that active participation actually creates more participation. By doing it, you build the very civic virtue that Schumpeter completely dismissed.
And this brings us to a fantastic synthesis by Donatella Della Porta. Notice how she maps this out. When you mix mass participation with deliberation, you get a highly coherent combined model. Participatory deliberative democracy. This is where citizens themselves, not just their elected representatives, are actually doing the deliberating to make collective decisions. It's basically the ultimate form of engaged democracy.
But what happens when these thick, complex, heavily legal models go too far? That's our final stop. Section 5, the political constitutional pushback.
Theorists in this camp totally reject what they call the juridification of politics. Basically, they think that by relying so heavily on thick liberal constitutionalism, we've handed way too much power over to unelected judges and elite courts. They argue that true democracy means we have to resolve our disagreements through active, yes, very messy, political contestation right out in the open in the legislature.
So this sets up a really profound structural clash. On one side, you have liberal constitutionalism, which deeply trusts the courts to guard democracy and protect our individual rights from majorities going rogue. But on the exact opposite side, political constitutionalism argues that this elite juristocracy actually undermines the will of the people. They demand we return the power back to the active political sphere of elected legislatures so we can hash out our own disputes.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. As we look back over our journey, it becomes incredibly clear that democracy is absolutely not a monolith. It's this dynamic, highly contested ecosystem. The minimalist model is that thin baseline everyone else is reacting against. The liberal model overlaps with the deliberative one to make sure minority voices are protected. Participatory merges with deliberative so the conversation isn't just a bunch of elites talking to each other. And even deliberative models still rely on minimalist voting as a fallback when everyone just can't agree. Finally, political constitutionalism pushes back against the liberal reliance on the courts. They are constantly overlapping, competing, and balancing each other out.
So I'm going to leave you with a final thought to ponder based on everything we've explored in this explainer. Look closely at these very distinct conceptions. Which of these systems do you think we actually live in right now? And honestly, more importantly, which one do you want to live in to best secure freedom and equality for the future? Thank you so much for learning with me today. Keep asking the big questions.